first Final Fantasy was ported in Japanese in 1989, a year before it sailed to the US. It was revised for the MSX2, a Microsoft-sponsored device made available by numerous manufacturers. The personal computer's color palette bolstered the game's vibrancy, but the pixel count remained the same. It suffered from new loading times, and games had to be saved on extra blank floppies, but you could have as many saves as you had space. On December 9, 2000, with relationships between Square and Nintendo still frayed, Final Fantasy went handheld for the first time. But instead of the Game Boy Advance, it was released for the WonderSwan Color, a portable device from Bandai. 8 bits of graphical detail were added to the heroes, monsters, and backgrounds, and gameplay elements were included that mirrored updates the franchise had developed in the 13 years since the original launched on the Famicom. Final Fantasy I on the WonderSwan was released the same month the handheld hit stores, could be purchased as a promotional bundle, and ended up being the Swan's top-selling game. Neither the WonderSwan nor the MSX2 was popular in America, so the States got an updated copy of Final Fantasy I for the first time in a 2-disc set called Final Fantasy Origins, released in 2003. Origins introduced a bestiary and art gallery, along with a remixed musical score tuned to the standard set in Final Fantasy IX, and 2 difficulty settings. But Origins was not the first time Final Fantasy was ported over. Chronicles was released 4 years earlier. The collection included 4 and Square favorite Chrono Trigger. Being from the 16-bit era, the graphics in 4 remained mostly untouched. In 1999, Final Fantasy Anthology brought 5 to the US, legally for the first time. America's intro to the job system was paired with Final Fantasy VI. Following Anthology, Origins was released last, and brought 2 overseas for its American premiere, along with 1. All of the PS1 remakes were developed by Tosei, who was also responsible for bringing Valkyrie Profile and Final Fantasy Tactics to the PSP. Moving from a cartridge to a CD, the games also suffered from slow loading times, but they started and ended with breathtaking pre-rendered cinemas showing Amano's 2D creations in motion. Finally, Nintendo and Square buried the hatchet, likely after Square saw the breakout hit that was the Game Boy Advance. And 2003 saw the release of the first Final Fantasy for the system, Tactics Advance. The new Game Boy was capable of reproducing the visuals of the Super Nintendo, and then some, so Square, now Square Enix, called upon Tosei to recall its legacy once again. To engage role players that had potentially played these games 1, 2, 3, even 4 times already, the advanced versions added new monsters, abilities, dungeons, storylines, and slight graphical touches. The music, while not as crisp as on the PlayStation, could be replayed at any time from an all-new music player available in each port. While the PlayStation recreations ended in a compilation of the first 2 Final Fantasies, Tosei began with another joint retelling of 1 and 2 called Dawn of Souls, released in 2004. Dawn of Souls felt similar to the easy mode found in Origins, without the option to play at normal difficulty. These changes were implemented to favor the GBA's family-oriented audience. But the fans weren't left behind. Dawn of Souls featured several added dungeons included in 2 extended mini-adventures you could unlock by completing each game, called Soul of Chaos and Soul of Rebirth. Soul of Chaos took you deep within each of the temples unlocked when you destroyed the 4 fiends one by one. These dungeons were up to 40 levels deep, had randomly generated floors, and showcased bosses returning from Final Fantasy III, IV, V, and VI. Soul of Rebirth mode continued the story of Final Fantasy II into the afterlife, following deceased characters Minwu, Scott, Joseph, and Ricard. You had to unite the fallen warriors and guide them to a makeshift town run by a bewildered Cid, and through a light version of the Emperor's Pandemonium. Each year following brought back another fantasy on the durable handheld. 4 opened up a new dungeon called the Lunar Ruins that offered character-specific trials, rewarding the player with some of the most powerful items in the game. Final Fantasy V added 4 new jobs, a 30-floor bonus dungeon, and an additional stage called the Cloister of the Dead. Finally, 6 in 2007 included new spells, summons, and an extended dungeon called the Dragon's Den. 2006, most of the original Final Fantasies had been remade at least 3 times, but one chapter remained completely untouched. Final Fantasy III, released only for the Famicom in 1990, was reimagined for the Nintendo DS 16 years later in 2006. In addition to being the first time American audiences could legitimately experience the 3rd volume in the numeric saga, it gave the original game a substantial facelift. The overhead view of the earlier games was given a more dynamic feel, and battles were now in 3D. The basic job system and plot development remained primarily the same. 3 for the DS gave the previously anonymous protagonists small introductory stories, but Luneth, Ark, Refia, and Ingus still functioned as all-purpose adventurers, like their nameless ancestors. Cutscenes were added to depict the new characters, and subtle plot elements were fleshed out, but the overall story was unchanged. All of the classic jobs returned, some reflected their more modern titles, and Onion Knight was now a bonus job, as the orphans began as freelancers. Guests also aided the party on rare occasions instead of merely tagging along. After their sprites were preened and polished a record 4 times, few imagined that Square Enix would consider a 5th remake to be in order. But with the handheld market opening up beyond Nintendo's empire, Final Fantasy I and II arrived on the PSP in the summer of 2007 to celebrate the original's 20th anniversary. The widescreen upgrades looked better than ever, crammed in all of the content from the PS1 and GBA iterations, and featured even more bonus quests and spells. While these revisions have come with new dungeons, difficulty levels, and archived information, they've also received adjustments to their dialogue and narration. When dealing with fantasy names and mythological references, words do not translate directly. Making sense of squares is an ongoing source of debate among the Final Fantasy community, and the scripts are constantly being revised and updated to more correctly reflect the original Japanese content. This has been both enlightening and alienating to fans of other languages, as certain aspects were corrected from previous mistranslations, while the others were obscured by concepts that had little to no meaning when translated more accurately. Back in the infancy of Square's role-playing empire, memory and coding requirements were legitimate hurdles for naming and text. This affected both Japanese and English audiences and led to changes such as Goblin being referred to as Imp in the original and several subsequent fantasies. This also forced the early storytellers to work with very limiting dialogue space. Complex emotions and relationships were very challenging as characters couldn't express themselves to their imagined limits. This wall was removed as technology developed, and the ports of the original games were given more complicated lines of dialogue than their predecessors. Along similar lines, some concepts translated more loosely than others. This allowed for greater specificity for certain recurring themes in future games, as well as remakes. This could be as simple as Shiva's signature attack, now known as Diamond Dust, originally being titled Gem Dust, or as complicated as the etymology of the Dark Knight ability Soul Eater, originating as simply as dark or darkness. When dealing with names or famous mythological creatures, the sound profiles of different languages came into play. Translators may not have been initially aware of this issue, which led to certain characters or places having subtle mistranslations in earlier versions. A single letter or sound may have been changed, such as the original kingdom of Corneria in Final Fantasy being corrected to the more anglicized Cornelia. The Fiend of Fire in the first game, Kari, was probably initially intended to be named Kali, after the destructive Hindu goddess. However, she received the moniker Malorus from her Final Fantasy IX incarnation for Origins and Dawn of Souls. Certain sounds that exist in some languages do not exist in others, or may be represented by different letters or combinations. This, in addition to early memory restrictions, turned the translation of certain creatures into a guessing game of sound recognition. Sometimes notorious monsters were translated correctly nearly all of the time, such as everyone's favorite floating eye being named for the Persian demon Ahriman. Some were more challenging, however. Thus, the creature from 6, first translated as Pumbaba, had no seeming connection to anything in recognized lore. Add the correctly translated Humbaba, and the beast took its place among the many facets Final Fantasy borrowed from the Babylonian tradition, in this case, most specifically, from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Oftentimes, when dealing with myths of other cultures, sounds that exist in the original language cannot be duplicated at all or even approximated. Then, when translated into other languages, the new forms lacked the sounds from either the parent or the core translation. The end result was a word that barely resembled what was intended. This game of translation telephone is seen in the four fiends from Final Fantasy IV, who were originally meant to be a reference to Dante's Inferno. Scarmiglione, Barbaricha, Cagnazzo, and Rubicante were all devils known as Malabranche, who dwelled in the fifth ridge of the eighth layer of Hell, Malabolge. A number of sounds in the Italian language became lost when translated into Japanese, and even more were lost on its first translation into English. It may be easy to see how Rubicante became Rubicant, or even how Barbaricha became Valvalis. However, without all of the pieces to the puzzle, Milon bears little resemblance to the original Scarmiglione. Some concepts were deemed too risque for American audiences in the early stages of Final Fantasy. This begot translations with religious-free concepts, dialogue, and abilities, among other things. An example of this from Final Fantasy IV was the exclusion of Rosa's Prey ability and the change of Holy to White. These were corrected for the GBA port. However, not all of the updated translations made universal sense. With the US release of Final Fantasy VIII, the spell system switched from a progressive numeric system to the one with various suffixes the franchise had been using from the start. Fire 2 and Fire 3 became Fira and Firaga. Nearly all of the remakes adhere to this newer system of naming spells, changing the names of many magic attacks to reflect their modern nomenclature. Whether or not this made sense in the Japanese language, it changed the English system from one that showed progression to a system that made no categorical sense when translated and created nonsense forms of actual words. Final Fantasy is not the only series to be remade several times, but it has received more ports than anything else, 17 so far. And those don't include the original localizations, which had language discrepancies fans wouldn't become aware of for another decade. But just like Square is eager to start drawing on a blank slate with each new Final Fantasy, they're also willing to admit when they've made a translation goof, and work continually to get closer to the original version. This means there might still be hidden meanings out there that those with a command of both English and Japanese have yet to discover. Join us next week for the stirring conclusion to Game Trailer's 13-part retrospective. In the final installment, we'll build a Final Fantasy game from scratch, considering all the necessary elements that make up a chapter in this landmark series, and look forward to what the future holds for the franchise.